I'm a researcher who just graduated from Trinity College, Dublin. My emphasis there was digital folklore, so to speak. And Jen just graduated from UNT with an emphasis in media studies. So the kind of stuff that I'm looking at is basically depictions of what are called originary landscapes in the early post-internet era. That is roughly from the dot-com boom in the 1990s to the 2018 repeal of network neutrality regulations in the US, which, even though it strictly just applied to the US, it had very far-reaching implications for the global internet. And the theory that I'm working with today is, in Japanese, it's called Genfūkei, but it translates roughly to originary landscape. And it's a theory that proposes that the personal and collective memories of a work's creators and readership can kind of fuse, which, if the pattern is repeated enough times. So this forms a literary trend that contributes to nostalgia, but also feeds off of existing nostalgia. So yeah. So just kind of briefly to go through the theory that I'm working with. It was coined by a critic, Takeo Okumo, in 1972. And it's made up of the characters of Gen, which translates roughly to original, Fu, which is sometimes wind, and then in modern Japanese refers to an original quality, and Kei, which is scenery. So the direct translation would be something like original quality scenery, but a lot of scholars translate it as like primal landscape or archetypal landscape. It describes this phenomenon that occurs both in literature, and it also describes the framework of analysis this guy created to talk about that literature. So what actually is it? And I think I'll actually skip. Yeah, I think this is probably a better slide to explain this. So basically, this guy is arguing that the originary landscape appears in fiction, and it's this quasi-remembered fantasy of a childhood home. It doesn't necessarily have to be your childhood home, but regardless of whether or not you grew up there, when you see media or read literature with this setting depicted, because of whatever culture you grew up in, you feel a kind of familiarity with that. And in Japan, the scenery is usually described as furusato, which means like old village, and it usually refers to countryside scenery that's really common in like Makoto Shinkai films, in Ghibli films, that sort of thing. This is like a very recognizable kind of heartland space for Japanese people. And there are comparable originary landscapes for basically anywhere in the world. In the US, I'd say like the Midwestern suburban like white picket fence neighborhood is probably that, even though most of us did not grow up in neighborhoods like that. We all kind of like are familiar with the imagery associated with them. So that contextualizes it a little bit. And Okuno's 3 criteria for the originary landscape in fiction are classlessness, spontaneity, and interrelatedness or interconnectedness. And classlessness is the one that I want to focus on today for this presentation. So the way that he kind of describes the originary landscape is that it's often depicted as classless, even though the real life landscapes it's based off of were not classless, because nothing really is. In the Japanese context, this is the repeated motif of harappa, which were these empty lots that dotted the Japanese landscape roughly up until the economic boom of the 1980s. And these lots formed a very important like network of children's play spaces. And so in literature depicting that time, you will see these empty lots crop up a lot. If anyone has seen like Kids on the Slope or Arakawa Under the Bridge, like there's tons of anime that you're probably familiar with that have this kind of imagery. But in reality, Okuno points out harappa were not classless because proximity to a play space is obviously determined by what neighborhood you live in, which is determined by usually your family's income, right, where you live in the city. And that then impacts your opportunities to meet other children. So it's all kind of, none of it's classless, but these spaces are often depicted in Japanese literature, he argues, as classless spaces. And this obviously also applies to digital originary landscapes. So when we're talking about like websites we grew up on or like the internet of my day, people tend to describe the internet as very egalitarian, as a great equalizer, but in reality, internet access is a resource like anything else, and some people have greater access to that resource than others. You usually need a laptop or an iPhone, or at least need to live close to a public library with a computer lab. So that applies to the digital divide as well. And again, specifically in the Japanese context, studying this kind of nostalgic imagery is really important. It's important in any context, but specifically in the Japanese context, the Genfūkei imagery has been used to support historical revisionism. One of my favorite scholars who speaks on the topic points out that a lot of the time it distances individual regions of Japan from their indigenous roots, so it kind of homogenizes the culture, and that's obviously used in support of nationalism and those sorts of things. So lots of reasons why nostalgia is deserving of a critical eye, and nostalgia studies is a very it's a very broad and well researched field. However, it's not really been thoroughly applied, I feel, to nostalgic pieces of media that are digital in nature. Sometimes the term that will be used is born digital literature. So media that is about online space and was created and disseminated online. The early post-internet era is being mythologized. It's in the process of being mythologized now, because a lot of the millennial, especially older millennial users who quote unquote grew up on the internet are now, they're adults, fully fledged adults, and they're telling stories about childhood spent online. So we need to study those stories and be critical of that kind of nostalgia. So this kind of led me to this idea of the fictive remembered internet, which is this collectively imagined version of the late 90s and early 2000s web that millennials tend to recall with fondness, even though it's maybe a version of the web that never really existed. And so I'm arguing that that is an originary landscape. And it also kind of explains this phenomenon I like to call the internet as play space, whereas people oftentimes will remember the internet they grew up on as being a better internet. And you could argue that in some ways it was certainly less privatized and less centralized, but also people remember it as a better internet because they were children and they had a more exploratory time on the internet, sort of free of adult priorities. Whereas when users grow up, they have different concerns and priorities, and they become more critical of services and platforms and products. I found that in my research process, I was looking a lot at forums, Discord servers, anywhere where people were discussing cyber nostalgia and discussing nostalgia for the golden age of the internet. And something that I found was a lot of these users were not just nostalgic for their internet, but for an inexpensive internet. Most of the people that I looked at, most of the comments that I looked at mentioned these hyper-specific services and locations, so websites. Most of them were low cost or free to play gaming places, early social networks and blogging platforms, hosting services like Yahoo GeoCities, file sharing extensions that are not used as frequently now, or some of them just don't exist anymore. So people are nostalgic for an internet that is specifically lower cost. And some of the observations that I made based on these comments is that the fictive imagined or the fictive remembered internet is constructed in contradiction to today's internet. So these are the kind of notions that people feel when comparing the internet now to the internet they grew up on. The first notion is that uniformity has replaced personalization. The second is that content has hypersaturated its platforms and is thus regarded as disposable by both consumers and creators. The third is that the chaotic internet of their youth has been replaced by corporate regulation. And the fourth is that anonymity used to be respectable, but is now discouraged while transparency is encouraged. So these are, and I'm not making any claims about whether or not these are true or to what degree, just because we don't have time for that in this presentation. But these are the notions people have about that time. These are what I've observed. So moving forward, I'm looking at all this stuff specifically with Homestuck as a case study, because Homestuck depicts that early internet. It depicts the internet of the early 2000s. So I'm looking at how digital locations of that early post-internet period are being represented And furthermore, what role do class signifiers play in supporting that depiction of online landscape? So I assume that if you came to this panel, you know what Homestuck is, but I'll explain it just in case. It's a multimedia webcomic released between 2009 and 2016. It's got a lot of words in it. It took me a long time to read. And it tends to comment on these early 2000s multiplayer RPGs and a lot of the cultures that cropped up around them. So it's usually kind of thought of as being more or less reflective of what people felt about the internet during the time the comic is set, which makes it very interesting to study if you're interested in cyber nostalgia. So because I'm focusing on Okuno's criteria of class or classlessness, that's where I'm going with this. It might kind of, if you've read Homestuck, it might seem odd that I'm focusing on class in Homestuck, or it might not, depending on your reading of the comic. But each of the kids kind of is very identifiably in a particular socioeconomic situation at the beginning of the story. John is like the new rich, or like upper middle class / wealthy. Rose is obviously old money. Dave is situated in kind of an inner city suburb in what's implied to be the Houston Metroplex. And Jade lives on like a technologically advanced Pacific island. So each of the kids have like these very different socioeconomic lifestyles and backgrounds. And during the game that they play that basically kickstarts the plot of the comic, the server player manipulates the client player's environment in real time, building new rooms, remodeling existing rooms, destroying rooms, and deploying objects. So this is interesting because the internet that they communicate on, since they're internet friends, is depicted as largely classless. It seems that the kids are mostly unaware of each other's like situations, or they don't care. They're just hanging out and talking with their friends. But then once they start playing Spurb, and the actual plot of the comic starts, their various situations do inadvertently become relevant. And that's because the items available for creation in the game depend on the affordances and limitations of their surroundings, which are derived from class. The materials available in the game are determined by the assets that are in the kids' houses prior to the beginning of the game session. So kind of what they can do is limited somewhat by like where they live and that sort of thing. And also somewhat related is that motif of commodity fetishism. I would call Homestuck a hotbed of commodity fetishism. The ubiquity of the brands in the narrative is kind of almost shocking. Like I'm surprised that like Nick Cage didn't sue. I guess he doesn't care what happens to his name anymore. But yeah, if you read the comic, you know there's like Foodstuffs brand Betty Crocker, Gushers gummies, Doritos, Insane Clown Posse, like they're all in there. And a lot of the use of products serves to date the work, so it helps locate it in a very specific time and place, either through memes or through like deploying, I guess, name dropping. So like deploying the names of particular celebrities or public figures. And what's kind of interesting about this is that it's a little conspiratorial. It invites the reader of the comic to fantasize about the role that these brand mascots might play in one's own life. These cultural icons can become spectators in one's domestic space and also in the overarching narrative. They're all assigned new roles and value systems, so they're effectively transformed into original characters. The Insane Clown Posse that are featured in Homestuck are not just an eccentric musical group, but like members of an invading alien army, or allies at least. So the commodity fetishism in Homestuck serves to kind of help build the digital landscape that the comic is set in, because it dates the work and it kind of locates it in a particular time and place using particular like names and images that would be familiar to the readers and to the characters. And finally, the actual structure of the comic itself is kind of nostalgia bait, interestingly enough. Obviously, Spurb is modeled after like open world games, so Minecraft, Earthbound, The Sims, etc. But the format that the content of the comic is presented to readers in is closer to text parser games like Zork, which is out of the 1980s. So the text parser, if you're not familiar, and I wasn't before I started this research project because it's before my time. The text parser is like an older style of adventure game where the players type commands into a text box and the game's engine, if possible, translates that command into a performable action. So like all of the imperative text in the Homestuck comment is meant to be like basically the text that the player, who's I guess the reader in this case, or is assumed to be at the beginning of the comic, is typing into this text parser engine. So this framing device is kind of like in and of itself like a fetish object linked to cybernostalgia, in that it's letting the comic tap into and profit from this very deep well of collective cultural nostalgia that is embodied by this bygone form of the text parser. So basically my findings were that like the like representations of digital landscapes in Homestuck paralleled really interestingly with representations of like the quote unquote real world that the kids are in, because in the real world like they have to deal with like brands and celebrities, and they have these like very obviously classed lives. There are a lot of like tangible and recognizable class signifiers in their lives, and then they go into this online space where they don't really care about that, and it's presented as being very classless, which leads me to believe that the originary space theory that Okumo developed would fit really, really well with analyzing the setting of Homestuck, that digital originary space as Genfūkei. Homestuck's portrayal of online spaces as classless and its use of brand name products and public figures date the work. So even if you like didn't know when this comic was released, you'd probably be able to read it and be like, this is the internet of like the early post-internet era specifically. And it depicts that internet as chaotic, as this kind of paradise play space that is being encroached upon by the realities of real life, before the script is flipped, and I guess you could say like the game begins to encroach upon their real lives. So yeah, I've covered all of Okumo's criteria in my dissertation, but we don't have time for that. So if you have further questions, or if you want to read more about originary space theory and cyber nostalgia, I guess hit me up. You can always read that if you'd like. And we're gonna move on to the next presentation. Oh dear. Yeah, God. Okay. Oh yeah, I can do this. Okay. She's loading. Hi, I am Jen Cardenas. I'm a recent graduate from the University of North Texas. And as Ray said, I was a media studies Master of Arts student. And this is some of the research that I did while I was in that program. So let's do that. Yeah, Zoom is still recording it on, so I'm going to share the new video. Yep. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to basically be talking about the obstacles that fans encounter when they're trying to archive and preserve these born digital texts, because there's a lot of things that happen when you have these interactive, technologically supported texts. And when I say text, for those of you who aren't familiar with media studies, that just refers to a body of work. Oh dear. Okay, so yeah, as my partner said, Homestuck is very big. There's a lot of content that would need to be archived. There's thousands upon thousands of panels, and specifically there's, if you're familiar with Adobe Flash, Flash supports over 4 hours of video content in Homestuck, as well as about an hour or so of this interactive Flash content. So Adobe Flash, which is a multimedia platform for animating and other such things, underpins a lot of the things that are in Homestuck. And as many of you might know,
On the 31st of December 2021, Adobe Flash officially died. It no longer exists. So there's a lot of stuff that has been lost, a lot of websites, a lot of art, a lot of animation, which is very tragic, and a lot of that has not been archived. But someone did archive Homestuck. So the unofficial Homestuck collection is a fan-made archive. It is free to download and it runs as a browser. So instead of being on a website, you download a browser and you download all of the assets and then you connect the two, and then you have this offline browser that you use to be able to re-experience Homestuck and be able to play the Flash files as originally intended. And that was created by an internet user who goes by Bambosh. He has shared some of his reasons for making the archive, which we're going to go over shortly. So these were my research questions, which is, what are the fan archival practices that were used to create TUHC? And what does this archival repertoire reveal about what I call fandom paratextual memory surrounding Homestuck? And we'll go over these terms in a moment. So we're just going to go over my literatures really quick that I was drawing from. So a lot of people think of the internet as a place that's really easy to archive stuff, as sort of a repository of human history and information, but it's actually terrible for that purpose because it requires, oh yeah, let me take this off. It requires a lot of technological support that is constantly changing. So just like we saw with Flash, just kind of not suddenly, but kind of suddenly ceasing to exist. If you lose a small piece of technological support, it can just completely obliterate an Alexandria library worth of information suddenly. So the only way that the internet actually works as an archive is through constant human labor. And so then I'm drawing a lot from Angela DeKosnik, who wrote a book called Rogue Archives. And so then she defines these archives as internet sites that can be accessed by all online users with no paywalls or institutional barriers, that allow all content to be streamed or downloaded in full, that are committed to the persistent publication and long-term preservation of all content that they store, that have search and retrieval features so that users can locate specific texts, and that have either weak ties or no affiliations with traditional memory institutions such as the government archives, university libraries, and brick and mortar museums. So basically just something you can access for free that has a lot of stuff in it and you can find specific pieces of the text in it. So it's important to point out that like archives, they don't just exist. Like I was saying, like it takes a lot of human labor to preserve information. Any information we have today is because someone wanted us to have it in the future. And so then here we're talking about specifically fan labor. There's a lot of texts that just aren't being preserved. Webcomics are not very high on the Library of Congress's radar, as you might imagine. So there's a lot of amateur people that are just making these archives. And so what I'm doing here is I am studying the labor that those fans are doing, specifically Bambosh. Like what were the choices that were made to create this archive? Not looking at it as just a thing, but as a thing that is created and is maintained, right? So for these people who are making these choices, two of the most important things that they have to consider is something called remediation. So in media studies, that refers to the act of taking a text and moving it from one medium to another. So my example that I have up here is if you had, for example, a console game and you wanted to like put that on a website to be playable online, that would be remediation. You're taking it from, you know, maybe a disc or something, and you're making it into this thing that's like accessible on a website, right? And so then when you remediate something, one of the most important things you have to consider is something that's called affordances, and it's another kind of fancy term. It just refers to the possibilities that objects in someone's worlds offer for action based on someone's perception. So it's something that is based on both the actual object and what I perceive I can do with it. So for example, this microphone is intended for speaking, but also like I could, I guess, hit somebody with it. It's not the intended purpose, but like I perceived it and I've thought of that. So that's an example of like affordances, is that like I could use it to project my voice. I could also use it for something else if it occurs to me. So when you're talking about a digital text, especially ones that are interactive, like what can you do with it? So like there's a lot of ways that people use like The Sims in a way that is not the intended purpose, but there's also just a lot of things that are intended to be done in The Sims. So it's like questioning, what can I do with this? So when you remediate something, obviously affordances are going to be really important for an interactive text. So if I'm doing that action of porting a console game to a website, I'm going to have to think about control mapping. I'm going to have to think about software, like, can I actually do that? So these are the kind of questions that a fan archivist will ask when they are performing this labor. And another piece of context that I need to bring up here, I hope that you're all familiar with paratexts. Paratexts refer to information that is on the borders of a text. So usually that would be something like if there's an author's note, if there's like a little blurb on the back of the book, if there's a fan wiki, if there's an interview, for example, that an author has and they're talking about a work, that would be a paratext. It's something that informs you about the text that's like, it's kind of on the borders of being part of it, but not quite. That's a paratext. And so when you're talking about a digital text, something that you have to talk about, according to this scholar, Loki, is a deep structure paratext. So he's talking about a digital text as something that has both a surface structure, which is just like what you see. So for example, like I've got this beautiful slide here, and you can just look at it and be like, yeah, it's like pink and blue and it's got text on it and stuff. And then the deep structure paratext would be like what like HTML and CSS and everything is actually being used to make it appear the way that it does. So that would be the deep structure. And he's arguing that deep structures are actually paratexts for digital text. So when you have a digital text, the actual coding that makes it work the way that it does is actually a paratext, like it's part of the work. And so then that's what we're looking at here, which is also related to the affordances, obviously. So if you're like, remediating something, you do actually have to think about the deep structures. You have to think about like what's going to make this game work the way that I want it to, what's going to make this animation work the way that I want it to. So these are deep structure paratexts. And when you are thinking about paratext and what to include in an archive, you do have to kind of think about canon. So canon, you're probably all familiar, refers to sort of the true narrative events of a given text. And so if I'm like, I want to archive something, I have to think about what is necessary to be included in the archive in order for it to be considered complete. So like, even if I was a fan of something that was fairly self-contained, say like a movie, there's probably a lot of film scholars that would be like, you can't just archive the movie, you have to archive the advertisements that were like, being put out at the time, you have to archive the posters, you have to archive any interviews with the cast members and the director or something like that. So you have to decide what counts as canon, what counts as essential information that someone needs to have to experience this thing. And so when you're an archivist and you're doing this, there's amateurs, fans with emotional investments, they're making these decisions. So finally, this is kind of the cornerstone here, the cornerstone term is fandom paratextual memory. So there's a couple of scholars, Gars and Hale Hansen, and they did a study with Doctor Who fans and like what they decided to archive about like old Doctor Who. And they used this term called paratextual memory, which is the use of paratext with an effective memory work in the present and for a projected future. And effective in this context means emotional. And paratextual memory attempts to reproduce the spatio-temporal experience of the original text and thus potentially maintains an authentic fan self-narrative in terms of having been there. So spatio-temporal, it's space and time. It's like the feeling of like being in the specific place at the specific time. So the spatio-temporal experience of a text. And this having been there. It's like as if you had been there when the first Doctor Who episodes aired, as if you had been there as Homestuck was being published, right? So this is kind of the key thing I'm talking about here. Like, what is the Homestuck fandom paratextual memory? What does it consist of? What does it consider important? And how does it affect this archive that I'm going to be talking about here? So this is like from the download page for TUHC. So it is an archive created by Bamboche. It was first announced in October of 2020. It was met with really positive reception. And it is also allows mods as well. So it allows a lot of fan interactivity in what you're allowed to do with it. And it also includes a lot of enhancements to video and image quality. So that we're already encountering a little bit of problems in terms of like, if we're supposed to be recreating an authentic Homestuck experience, why is it that there are enhancements? Why are there abilities to mod things? So then we're already encountering some questions. So like the key one that I think is personally the most interesting possibly is accessibility. So Bamboche like specifically made the archive to be more accessible to basically everybody, but specifically in terms of reading and sight disabilities. So much of Homestuck is text-based. There's quite a lot of reading that you have to do, and usually the text is in Courier New Bold, and it's like size 0.14 font, and it's in like a lot of different fonts or font colors that are very difficult to read. And I personally had like a migraine every time I read Homestuck for longer than a few minutes. So I really felt this. And so then he included this feature where you could change the font and you could change the font size. You could change, I think also possibly the font color. You can change the spacing so that it's much easier to read. And he included fonts that are dyslexic friendly, like Comic Sans. So we're already like, why would you do this if you're trying to recreate the authentic experience of like as if you had been there? And so then my hypothesis based on this is that fandom paratextual memory is accessible when it comes to, or flexible when it comes to accessibility, because you have to be able to access the text to have been there. Like in order to feel as if you had been there at all, you have to actually allow people to be able to read it. And so then there's that element of flexibility in terms of authenticity. Like perhaps the most possible authentic version of Homestuck is not particularly accessible. And Bamboche mentioned several times throughout his download page, when you actually look at the browser itself, one of his primary goals was bringing in new readers. So that's kind of what we're working with here. He also included a great number of paratexts. So it has Sweet Bro and Hella Jeff, Namco High, Paradox Space. It also includes Andrew Hussey's personal blog and the original Homestuck forums. So that's quite a lot of content. So here we're encountering the reality that to this particular fan archivist, these vast amount of paratexts are actually like crucial to the experience of having been there. They're crucial to like the spatio-temporal reality of having watched Homestuck come out. Is like not just the comic itself, but all of this other stuff that was around it, all of these inside jokes upon inside jokes and all of these companion websites and all of this other stuff, that this is something that's really important. Is almost this like textual chaos. And I think that this is best encapsulated in the new reader mode. And this is a tweet of someone talking about it that I think is really important for conceptualizing exactly what this is. But essentially, it is a mode where you start reading the comic and it will have only the first page available. And then as you read the comic, you go to the next page and the next page and the next page. If you go to say, I don't actually know if this is true, but like say like page 320 or something like that. And then when you reach that page, it'll unlock a new paratext. So I think that like in the case of this, like an example that some of you might be familiar with is like when you first reach a page where with Sweet Bro and Hella Jeff that's embedded in Homestuck, you would then suddenly have access to that paratext, which was already in the browser, but you couldn't actually access it. Like it's all locked. It's like spoiler free. So it's like you get to progress chronologically through not only the webcomic itself developing, but also all of its paratexts. And so then this is someone talking about how like this is for me is like what it felt like to experience Homestuck, is like not just the comic, but just all of this stuff around it. And that's why this new reader mode has been introduced, is like you have full control over like experiencing it all at the same time, which I think is quite cool. And also a note is that while this archive is huge, it doesn't actually include a lot of the other official Homestuck stuff. So the epilogues, Homestuck 2, and then these 2 games that came out in the last several years are not included in this archive. And that is because Bamboche included a note that said that he considered these texts to be official, ongoing, actively maintained sources of income for the Homestuck team. And so then he very clearly distinguished between something being an archive and being piracy. So he's arguing that TUHC is an example of an archive, and it's not piracy because it's not taking from these things that are he considers to be like sources of financial gain for the Homestuck team. And so then there's this sort of like, it is not the most complete Homestuck archive because of this financial loyalty to the original company. So these things are just not being included. They're not being archived, but because he considers them, well, partially to be under active maintenance, meaning they're not going to vanish, but also because they support the company that, well, that created Homestuck in theory. And so then that's basically all of the information. But and to return to that issue of deep structure paratexts, deep structure paratexts are obviously like an important cornerstone of Homestuck paratextual memory, because the entire archive, like the inciting incident for creating the archive was a browser that could run Flash files. So that sort of deep structure paratext of the Flash files is like what I would hypothesize a key part of Homestuck fandom paratextual memory is like if you go to the, I should have mentioned before, if you go to the website now, there's actually like YouTube videos that are embedded in the place of the Flash files. So you can like click play on the YouTube video and it'll play, but it's not the Flash file. And for those of you who are familiar, there's like some pages where the Flash file is actually the entire window and not just the usual window that it is. And so it really changes what the experience is, because sometimes like it'll take you by surprise when something seems to come out of the frame, whereas like if it's embedded in a YouTube video, you can immediately tell that like, oh, something's gonna happen on the borders of this. So I would say that Flash itself is like a cornerstone of fandom paratextual memory in the case of Homestuck, that sort of deep structure paratext. And in addition to that, these sort of wider paratexts going outwards, all of these like side blogs, companion websites, and things like that, they're this key part of this spatiotemporal experience, watching them unfold simultaneously with the webcomic. So it's this very like interconnected, paratext heavy kind of comic that I think is really wonderful to study. And so I think that I consider this project to be a sort of first step in documenting the cultural losses after the loss of Flash, and also some ways that people have combated that process. So that is my whole presentation. And I can provide my bibliography upon request because I don't have it here. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your questions. And also, like, if any of you were reading Homestuck as it came out, I'd love to hear about what your memories of that experience were like, because I think we both started reading it after it had finished.
I started reading it late 2015, so it was like right at the end, so it doesn't really count. Yeah, that was before my time, unfortunately.
Since we're talking about Flash, I have to bring up Homestar Runner.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That was a good one.
Yeah, hopefully someone's archived that. I wouldn't know.
I'm sure they have.
Until your presentation, I had never even considered that. I may not be able to find that now if no one did.